Today, we're going to begin studying one of my favorite books of the Bible, the Gospel of Matthew. Matthew was one of the favorite early Gospels of the Christian church. Although the books in the New Testament were arranged in a variety of orders throughout history, Matthew always seemed to be first in the list. It's the longest gospel, the most quoted. Matthew's good news about Jesus is connected to the history of the Jewish and the Christian beliefs. The scriptures, the traditions, the reasons, and the experiences that both cultures endured. His narrative is vivid in the type of pictures he paints in the mind of about Jesus. They're memorable. My purpose for sharing this Bible study is to share with you over 20 years of study and meditation and prayer and insight, reflection into the Gospel of Matthew. Its background, its story, its characters, its conflict, its teachings, the meaning behind the scriptures, the application of the gospel to our lives. And my hope is that the passion that I love and I feel for this gospel will be mutual. I also want to reconstruct the original text in a slightly different way so as to keep stirring up the imagination and kindling a desire in our hearts to follow Jesus. Matthew wrote his gospel in the Greek language, which is both a beautiful and a unique language that expresses much more than our contemporary English language. The vivid pictures in the Greek open up a whole new experience of God's truth. Unfortunately, several of these qualities in the Greek language are lost in our English translations of the Bible. First, the Greek language distinguishes between an action that is done just once and an action that continues or an action that is sudden. In Matthew chapter 5, verses 23 through 24, for example, Jesus says, if your brother has an intense opposition against you, continue to leave your gift in front of the altar and first keep going and keep reconciling with your brother. There's continual action involved in that verse. He does not instruct the offender to just try one time to reconcile and then give up. No, he repeatedly says, go, go, go. Go and do not do anything else until reconciliation is achieved. Second, the Greek distinguishes between a singular you, an individual, and a plural you, a whole crowd of people. Another example, Matthew chapter 6, verses 1 through 2. Jesus starts by addressing all of his disciples when he says, all of you, be careful that you all don't keep giving alms to the poor in front of other people. He then points to one person, and he continues saying, and when you continue to give alms to the poor, you should not sound a trumpet before you as the hypocrites keep doing. So Jesus begins by talking to all of his disciples, but then he singles out one individual with an extra added teaching. Finally, Greek words have multiple meanings. And when understood culturally, these meanings can either enhance or change our perception of the gospel account. Here's a good example. In Matthew chapter 3, verse 7, and in chapter 23, verse 33, both Jesus and John the Baptist call the Pharisees brood of snakes. You brood of snakes, or you brood of vipers. Now, this is a contemptible Greek curse, which actually means mother murderers. We'll get into that when we get to those passages of Scripture. So does knowing that Jesus calls his enemies mother murderers change our perception about him? Perhaps. I've attempted to translate the Greek text into English in a way that communicates these lost, unique qualities. I admit my translation is not the most accurate translation of the Greek language. I did not intend it to be so. Nor, is it without mistakes. My intent is simply to present a new, deeper appreciation of Matthew's gospel. And so I hope you enjoy my translation and my commentary and the study questions that I will share with you as we continue to now journey through the Gospel of Matthew. Before getting into chapter 1, I want to share with you a little bit of an introduction to the Gospel. Although Matthew is traditionally associated with the Apostle Matthew, it is more likely that the Gospel was written by an anonymous Jewish author and his Jewish Christian community sometime between 50 and 100 AD. So roughly 30 to 70 years after the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus Christ. Surrounded by his community's sacred texts, which would have been Jewish texts, and traditions, the author uses them all with very serious respect. He uses also the Gospel of Mark, which was written prior to his Gospel, and a version of Luke that he shares, which is referred to as simply Q. This is a designation that comes from the German word Quell, which means source. So Matthew and Luke shared a source of information that Mark did not have, that was unique to just Matthew and Luke. This is referred to simply as the Q source, the Quell source. Matthew used a lot of Old Testament references as his major sources of information as well for writing his gospel, which he directed to his Jewish Christian community to express, clarify, and strengthen their faith in Jesus Christ. One source that had been a major influence on him was the Septuagint, or the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. He uses over 60 quotations from this Greek translation of the Old Testament. Matthew's Christian community consisted mostly of converted Jews who struggled to remain under the measures of the Jewish synagogue and the authorities while professing their belief in Jesus, the Son of God, as their Messiah. As tensions increased between Matthew's community and the Jews, alienating Matthew and his community from the traditional Jewish structures, Matthew's community began to refer to themselves as the church. They followed the leadership of Peter and believed that they were the continuation of God's holy people. Consequently, anyone who rejected Jesus as the Messiah, such as the Jewish scribes, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the high priests, they forfeited any claims to that special blessing. Most scholars place Matthew's community around the historical city of Antioch. Because Matthew's community was predominantly Jewish, his gospel contains many Jewish themes. Matthew discusses the law of Moses, ceremonial cleanliness, the Sabbath, the temple, Moses and David, the Messiah, and the fulfillment of Old Testament prophecies, all from a Jewish point of view. So it's important for us to understand that cultural inclusion to Matthew's gospel. He expected his community to be familiar with these subjects, and therefore he didn't feel the need, as Mark did, to explain their origins of detail. Matthew's structured his gospel around 5 main conversations of Jesus. We have the Sermon on the Mount, which presents the authoritative teachings of Jesus, who fulfills the law. That's in Matthew chapter 5, verse 1 through Matthew chapter 7, verse 28. The missionary commission, where Jesus sends his disciples to represent his ministry in chapter 10, verse 5 through 11, verse 1. The parable collection, one of my favorite areas, which portrays the hidden kingdom of heaven in conflict with the evil kingdom of this age. Chapter 13, verse 3 through 53. We have the congregational talk, which concerns the internal life of the church in chapter 18, verse 2 through 19, verse 1. And then we have a judgment discussion, which places his disciples' lives in the context of God's universal judgment and the triumph of his kingdom in chapter 23, verse 1 through chapter 26, verse 1. The story elements of the gospel then create the setting for these 5 specific conversations. The settings of Galilee and Judea are another important aspect of Matthew's gospel. Jesus begins in Galilee, and then he journeys to Jerusalem and Judea, where he experienced the greatest conflict of death and resurrection. So you can kind of break Matthew's gospel. The first section, chapter 4, verses 17 through chapter 18, verse 35, they take place up in northern Galilee. And then Jesus journeys in chapter 19, verse 1, to the very end, chapter 28, verse 20, down south and continues in Judea. Throughout his journey, Jesus instructs the church to learn and understand his teachings and to share those teachings with the whole world. However, accepting Jesus as the Messiah is not enough for Matthew. Believers must respond to Jesus. They must apply his teachings and do so with moral earnestness, eagerness to participate in the kingdom of heaven. One of the major themes of Matthew is that Jesus is King. Jesus himself uses the term kingdom of heaven 33 times and kingdom of God 4 times. He is called the Son of David 9 times, while Jerusalem is called the Holy City and the City of the Great King. Matthew carefully presents Jesus' credentials to be Israel's, and our, rightful king. The claim that Jesus is king is a game-changing identification for believers. No other gospel emphasizes God's kingdom as much as Matthew does. As king, Jesus has absolute power and can exercise absolute control over his own. And in this case, his own is all of creation. As king, Jesus can advance his interests. His citizens are called to obey his commands. If his subjects reject him, he can remove them from the kingdom. To say that Jesus is king is to say that he is our leader and no other. Jesus has the highest authority to govern our lives and to dictate what is right and what is wrong. When we call Jesus King of Kings and Lord of Lords, we affirm that in the end, all other rulers will be conquered or abolished, and Jesus alone will reign supreme over all creation. There is no power which can oppose him and win. There is comfort in knowing that Jesus is king. We don't need to control our own lives. You might say, what? Really? Yeah. We can let Jesus control, and we can rest assured he will do what is right. We just need to obey. We don't need to search the world for meaning. We don't need to go to India and contemplate the lint in our navel. No, life makes sense under the reign of Christ. God's kingdom is not about expanding our own egos. It's about renouncing sin. It's not about big words. It's about powerful actions. Life under Christ is not about what we have or who we are. It's about what we do and whose we are. Because Jesus is king, we too will, in subjugation to God, share in his ruling over the universe and the spiritual forces of wickedness arrayed against us as we live with our sovereign forever. The kingdom of Jesus, however, is not of this world. It transcends all racial, ethnic, and national boundaries. Although Jesus was born King of the Jews, he refuses all attempts to make him an earthly king. That is not why he became human. Nor is this what held him to the cross. Jesus came to be the king of God's new people and to establish his immortal kingdom on the royalty of sacrificial love and righteousness, rather than on violence and institutional oppression. Matthew's gospel consequently proves to Jewish readers that Jesus is their Messiah and their promised king. He is the one who inherits the promise to David of an everlasting kingdom. Matthew highlights Jesus' legitimate authority through the wise teaching and through his righteous living, using words of righteous and righteousness more often than the other Gospels of Matthew or of Mark, Luke, and John combined. Matthew also outlines the characteristic of the kingdom of heaven for both Israel and the church. So, Orthodox Jews would typically scoff at the assertion that Jesus is their king. Their rejection of Jesus as Messiah is therefore another dominant theme of the gospel. Because of their rejection, God postpones the fulfillment of his promises to Israel and subsequently extends his blessings to both Jew and Gentile through the church. Here's a few things for you to look at while reading Matthew and watching these video messages. Look for Matthew's purpose to prove to his Jewish audience that Jesus is the Messiah, the King. Look for Matthew to emphasize that Jesus fulfills the Old Testament prophecies. Matthew tells the story of Jesus as a retelling of the story of Israel. Look for Matthew to call the citizens of Jesus' kingdom to righteousness. Matthew will outline the obstacles and the hostility which the church will meet. Look for Matthew to reveal how Jesus planned to expand the kingdom of heaven. And finally, notice how Matthew commissions his community to spread the gospel to all the world. All right, you ready to begin? We're going to start by looking at the first 17 verses in chapter 1. I'm going to give you a little bit of a warning. This is one of the driest, most boring passages of Scripture in the Bible. And yet, it is jam-packed with Easter eggs waiting to be discovered. Here we go. Reading from Matthew chapter 1, verses 1 through 17. I'm going to read the passage, then we'll unpack the passage together, and we'll close out with some reflection questions for you to think about. All right. This is the record of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, son of David, son of Abraham. Abraham bore Isaac, and Isaac bore Jacob, and Jacob bore Judah and his brothers. And Judah bore Perez and Zerah of Tamar. And Perez bore Hezron, and Hezron bore Ram, and Ram bore Abinadab, and Abinadab bore Nahshon, and Nahshon bore Salmon, and Salmon bore Boaz of Rahab. And Boaz bore Obed of Ruth. And Obed bore Jesse, and Jesse bore David the king. All right, if you're watching this with someone else, go ahead and kind of nudge them back awake. David the king bore Solomon of the wife of Uriah. And Solomon bore Rehoboam, and Rehoboam bore Abijah, and Abijah bore Asa, and Asa bore Jehoshaphat, and Jehoshaphat bore Jehoram, and Jehoram bore Uzziah. Uzziah bore Jotham, and Jotham bore Ahaz, and Ahaz bore Hezekiah, and Hezekiah bore Manasseh. And Manasseh bore Ammon, and Ammon bore Josiah, and Josiah bore Jehoiakim and his brothers at the Babylonian exile. It's okay to yawn. It's okay to stretch at the moment. Kind of slap yourself in the face. Wake back up. After the Babylonian exile, Jehoiakim bore Shealtiel, and Shealtiel bore Zerubbabel, and Zerubbabel bore Abiud, and Abiud bore Eliakim, and Eliakim bore Azor, and Azor bore Zadok, and Zadok bore Akim, and Akim bore Eliud, and Eliud bore Eliezer, and Eliezer bore Matham, and Matham bore Jacob, and Jacob bore Joseph, the husband of Mary, by whom was born Jesus, who is continually called Christ. So then, all the generations from Abraham to David are 14 generations, and from David to the Babylonian exile are 14 generations, and from the Babylonian exile to Christ are 14 generations. We made it! We made it through the genealogy of Jesus according to Matthew's Gospel. All right, now as I mentioned, there are a ton of Easter eggs, mysteries waiting to be discovered in this really dry and boring list of names. So let's unpack this together. Well, first off, we get that Jesus Christ is the son of David. Matthew starts by connecting Jesus to David. This shows us that Jesus, as human, has the blood credentials to inherit David's throne. He has the legal right to rule his people Israel. Second, Matthew then connects him to Abraham. So he is the son of David, he is the son of Abraham. This shows that Jesus is the ultimate Jew, a child of promise. Jesus inherits the covenant promise of God to bless all of his people. So in case there was any wonder about Jesus' ethnicity, he's a son of Abraham. He's Jew to the core. Matthew then connects Jesus with Judah. Judah is the one whom God promised that the Messiah would come through. Back in Genesis chapter 49, verse 10, God promises in the first book of the Bible that the Messiah would come from the tribe of Judah. So Matthew picks up on that, and sure enough, Judah shows up in Matthew's genealogy. The next name that's fascinating is the name Tamar. Tamar is actually a woman. Matthew connects Jesus to Tamar. Tamar, back in Genesis chapter 38, committed incest with her father-in-law, Judah, when he refused to honor her right to marry his youngest son, Shelah. God proved in the story, back in Genesis chapter 38, that Tamar, in doing so, was more righteous than Judah, and so saved her from death. Matthew then connects Jesus to the name Rahab. Rahab is another woman. Rahab was a Canaanite prostitute who helped to hide the Jewish spies in Jericho before Joshua conquered the city in Joshua chapter 2 and chapter 6. Once again, God rescues Rahab from death. Although other Jewish records state that Rahab married Joshua after the fall of Jericho, some Jewish leaders, or I should say, some Jewish legends tie her to Salmon. Salmon was a tribal prince of Judah. We can see this in Numbers chapter 1 verse 7 and chapter 7 verse 12, in Ruth chapter 4 verses 20 through 21, and again in 1 Chronicles chapter 2 verse 11. Matthew is the only book of the Bible to say that Salmon bore Boaz of Rahab. So Jesus is connected to Tamar, who committed incest, and to Rahab, who was a foreign prostitute. Then Matthew connects Jesus to Ruth. Once again, a woman. Ruth, as we learn from the Old Testament book of Ruth, was a Moabite. She wasn't even Jewish, who chose to live in Israel with her mother-in-law, Naomi, even though she was considered an enemy of Israel. And her life was constantly in danger because she was considered a Moabite enemy. But God provided for her and kept her safe. Matthew then connects Jesus with Bathsheba, or as it is recorded, the wife of Uriah. Again, the wife of Uriah is a woman. Bathsheba committed adultery with David the king. Back in 2 Samuel, in chapters 11 and 12. And when she became pregnant by David, he had her husband Uriah murdered. David then took Bathsheba to be his own wife. And although God punished David and Bathsheba because David repented of his sin, God then loved their next child, Solomon, whom David the king bore of the wife of Uriah. Here's an interesting fact. Matthew's genealogy of Jesus is actually incomplete. When you get to the part where it says that Jehoshaphat bore Jehoram and Jeroham bore Uzziah, there's a break in the actual Old Testament lineage. Some names found in the Old Testament, like Ahaziah, Joash, and Amaziah, are omitted from Matthew's genealogy. We'll get into why he leaves those names out. Matthew's tables are also very vastly different from Luke's genealogy of Jesus. So it's important to note that as well. Okay. Finally, we get to Mary. Like the other four women in Matthew's genealogy, Mary is mentioned. Mary faced a life-threatening social scandal from which God had to rescue her. We'll get into that next week. She was found to be pregnant outside of marriage, which was punishable by death. Here's another important thing. All right, the Greek language, we got to really pay attention to this. I know this is getting really picky at the moment. Bear with me. All right, it says that Mathem bore Jacob, and Jacob bore Joseph, the husband of Mary. Then the Greek language changes and it says, by whom was born Jesus. So although the social status and inheritance are passed on through the father according to the Jewish customs, Matthew surprisingly shifts the focus of the end of his genealogy from Joseph to Mary. It doesn't say that Joseph bore Jesus like everything else. Mathem bore Jacob, Jacob bore Joseph. It does not say Joseph bore Jesus. It says Joseph, the husband of Mary, by whom. It goes back to Mary, not Joseph, who bears Jesus. It is through Mary that the incarnation, the joining of God's divine nature with our human nature takes place. and through whom Jesus receives his ethnic lineage. Matthew is very careful not to identify Jesus as the physical son of Joseph. No, Jesus is the physical son of God. So the Greek pronoun translated by whom in verse 16 is thus written in the feminine form, referring back to Mary alone. One more Easter egg to uncover here is that Matthew uses at the very end in verse 17 the symbolic number of 14. He says that all the generations from Abraham to David are 14, from David to the Babylonian exile are 14, and from the Babylonian exile to Christ are 14. So 3 times he repeats the number 14. 14 is the sum of the numerical value of the 3 letters in the Hebrew name of David. The 3 letters of D, W, D. That would be the Hebrew form of David. This is another way Matthew connects Jesus to David, the king. Although to do so, he has to leave out certain Old Testament names. So that's why the 3 names that I mentioned earlier are left out, so that the number can equal 14. By repeating the number 3 times, 14, 14, 14, Matthew reinforces the significance that Jesus is connected to David the king. That's one of Matthew's major emphasis. Jesus is the king. He is the son of David. He is the rightful heir to the throne. The number for David is 14. And so Jesus represents that number 3 times in his genealogy to just show and emphasize how important it is that Jesus is king. There you have it. Although Matthew's genealogy is dry and boring to read, when we carefully identify the names that Matthew specifically chose to add, we see that the emphasis of these verses show that Jesus is both king and Messiah. The Jewish people were waiting for a warrior king who would come and he would smash Israel's enemies, especially the Romans, and retake the throne of David from Herod the Great. So, here's your first reflection question. What kind of kingdom do you think Jesus is going to establish? Is he going to establish one where he marches an army on Jerusalem? Where he forces out the family of Herod the Great? Where he opposes the Roman Empire and is victorious? Or is it a different kingdom altogether? Jesus is the ultimate fulfillment of prophecy. How does Jesus fulfill God's promise that the Messiah will come from the tribe of Judah? Well, according to Matthew, Jesus is linked all the way back to the tribe of Judah. How does Jesus fulfill God's promise that a descendant of David will always sit on the throne? Jesus has a bloodline that goes all the way back to David. Why does Matthew include 5 women in the genealogy of Jesus? That is very, very progressive for Matthew's day. You did not do that back in that day. No, a person's genealogy always went through the male descendants. So for Matthew to include 5 women, that's a radical move for Matthew. And notice what kind of women he includes. He includes an incestophile, Tamar, who commits an incest. She has sex with her father-in-law. A prostitute, Rahab. A foreign Gentile woman who's not even Jewish, Ruth. An adulterer, Bathsheba. And a pregnant teenager, Mary. Why does Matthew do this? Why do you think Matthew includes these women? As we will see in next week's study, Matthew does so. He includes especially the first 4 women, Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, and Bathsheba, because all 4 women experienced life-threatening situations where God had to deliver them and keep them safe. Likewise, Mary, the mother of Jesus, this pregnant teenager, she too will experience a life-threatening situation where she will have to trust in God to be the one who delivers her. Here's another name that's very interesting. The connection of Jesus to the name Manasseh. Manasseh, according to 2 Kings verse 21, verses 1 through 9, was the worst, the most wicked and evil of all the kings. He did more to offend God than any other king. So why would Matthew include Manasseh? I mean, if he's got to leave out, a few names to make his genealogy equal 14, why not leave out Manasseh? Why include the worst bunch of the whole lot? Why place Manasseh in the royal line of Jesus? Well, think about it. If Manasseh, who was the most evil and wicked king in Judah's history, can be a part of Jesus' lineage, how much more can you and I be a part of Jesus' family? The covenant relationship between God and his people are important to Matthew. In his genealogy of Christ, he connects Jesus to God's covenant with Abraham, God's covenant with David, and God's covenant with the expected Messiah. Through Abraham, God promises to give land to Israel. You can read about that in Genesis chapter 12, verses 2 and 3. Through David, God promises to give peace to Israel. 2 Samuel chapter 7, verse 10 through 12 and verse 16. And through the expected Messiah, God promises to give knowledge and forgiveness to Israel. Jeremiah chapter 31, verses 31 through 34. So what does the connection of Jesus to these promises, the promise for land, the promise for peace, and the promise for knowledge and forgiveness, what did they mean to Matthew's Christian Jewish community? And what do they mean for you today? Well, remember, Matthew's Jewish Christian community was living in a time of persecution where the Jewish synagogue was kicking out any Christian believers, persecuting not only them but their families. They were rejected by other family members. They were persecuted by the Romans who didn't understand. They lost home. They lost community. They lost inheritance. They lost land. So it was meaningful for Jesus to be a fulfillment to bring back what they had lost. A promise of peace and a promise of forgiveness, a promise of knowledge. How does Jesus fulfill those promises in your life? Why is it important to believe that Jesus is the rightful heir of David? I mean, why does Matthew use the number 14 3 times? Only the rightful heir of David can restore his throne. But again, is it going to be an earthly throne? Is it going to be a heavenly throne? What kind of throne? Now our interests are piqued. We got to keep reading to find out. My final question for you today is an application question, and only you can really answer this question. So take this question and reflect on it. What is God calling you to be, to do, or to change by reading the genealogy of Jesus Christ? Take a moment, go back. I know it's really dry and really boring, but reread Matthew chapter 1, verses 1 through 17. And ask yourself, what is God calling me to be, to do, or to change by reading this passage of Scripture? We'll see you next time as we continue with chapter 1. God bless.